Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for TWiT specials is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
We're going to interrupt briefly because we're starting to see some activity on Twitter about Steve Jobs, and I just want to check on this because we don't want to fall for a phony story, but I believe AP is reporting that Steve Jobs has passed away. So we're going to check this real quickly before we go any farther. And of course, you know, there was a rumor, remember, a couple of weeks ago that he had, and we will check that and get it as quick as we can. It is it's one of those things that's all over Twitter. AP is saying that Steve Jobs has passed away.
But AP have said things that aren't true before. So.
Yeah, so we will absolutely check on this, but it is absolutely all over Twitter right now. And that would explain, of course, why Steve Jobs did not make an appearance yesterday. Did you work with Steve, or was it after Steve's era when you went to Apple?
I actually went there just as he came back. So as I said, we've been doing these CD-ROM things, and then the internet did for CD-ROMs, and so the company I was working for didn't manage to jump in time, to pivot in time, if you like. And we were, the engineering side had been saying, let's work on the web, let's do more web-based stuff, and the business side was like, no, these CD-ROM things are enormously profitable. We make $1 million for doing one of these. We should keep doing those. And that was true up until Christmas '96, and suddenly that wasn't true anymore. And then we was trying to do the web development, but with the same kind of production model that we had for the CD stuff, which was didn't really have a great fit. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to build the 3D atlas of the web, which was, and we had a prototype that was downloading tiles over the internet.
Yeah, Apple is now confirming this, by the way. Apple is confirming. Yeah, Steve Jobs. Yeah, please do a breaking news right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Actually, I'm glad you're here, Kevin. I can't imagine anybody better to have here to do a talk about.
That's really sad.
It's very sad. He's very young. And, of course, MarketWatch has the story right now.
Wall Street Journal also reporting no details, just the fact that Apple has reported it.
Very sad. How much did you work with Steve at the time?
Not only indirectly. I didn't work with him directly. I saw him in the early '90s when he was at Next. We went and pitched the media editing stuff to him there.
Yeah.
That was when I got the sort of full force of the Steve demo in a small room.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that. What is that like?
That was we were visiting the developer guy there, talking about video editing, what was possible on the next step, and then Steve walked in with a lawyer he was pitching the Next machine to, and then sat down and gave this almost a one-on-one full press demo of the Next and what it could do, and how you could have audio and video and full images in your email, how you could revolutionize communication in the company, and how this would change everything. And, it was very much a net-centric vision in like 1991-ish. So it very much, he had that insight at that time, and the Next was what the web was built on. So that sort of insight early on that networking was the future was definitely a big chunk of that was Steve's vision too.
Contrast that to Microsoft, where they didn't know for another 3 or 4 years that the internet was going to be anything.
They didn't see that coming. And there's a great video of Steve Jobs from the developer conference in 1996-97 where he's doing Q&A with the audience. This is before he'd actually been appointed CEO, I think. This was 97. And he said, I have this idea of things that we could do by connecting the computer to the network, and there are a bunch of products that I really want to build here. And if you listen to that talk, you can actually see all the prefiguring of all the things that were built out later.
In 1997.
1997. He always had this long-term view.
Let me play a little bit of that. I think I have it at the 97 closing keynote. I think this is it. This is the Worldwide Developers Conference. I'll skip.
Thank you, and you've changed my life. And I sort of thought about that for a while. I thought, that's really rude. And it probably happens to him all the time, and I don't want to be like that. So I didn't do it. And in a way, I'm kind of glad that I hesitated, because it gives me an opportunity to thank him this morning in a public setting among people who probably understand that better than anyone else on the planet. So it's a special pleasure this morning to introduce and thank a person who has changed so many of our lives, Steve Jobs.
This is from the 1997 WWDC. Jobs had just come back.
Thank you. You're welcome.
That's interesting.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
There's a lot of developers happy to get Steve back, I'll tell you that.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate your not interrupting me from my dinner with what was hopefully a beautiful woman. I wanted to come and just have a chat this morning. I know you've been getting lots of presentations all week, so I didn't want to do a big fancy presentation. But what I want to do is just chat. And so we get to spend 45 minutes or so together, and I want to talk about whatever you want to talk about. I have opinions on most things, so...
I'm going to pull up very quickly. We're watching this talk, but I'm going to pause it for a moment and pull up very quickly apple.com/Steve Jobs, where they are now putting up the announcement that Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. There it is. Apple has lost a visionary and creative genius, and the world has lost an amazing human being. Those of us who have been fortunate enough to know and work with Steve have lost a dear friend and an inspiring mentor. Steve leaves behind a company that only he could have built, and his spirit will be forever the foundations of Apple. They are sending people to an email address if you have a memory you'd like to share or just condolences you'd like to share. Remembering Steve at apple.com. I'm sure that, Kevin, you're somewhat shocked by this. If you want to take off, Kevin, please do, but I would love to also have you stick around if you can.
I'll stick around and talk about this with you. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think when we saw not so long ago, it's a month ago, Steve's resignation, it was a clue that things were not going well. He had pancreatic cancer, a serious form of pancreatic cancer, 6 years ago, I think it was. And had been told at the time that he wouldn't survive. He did survive that. The cancer, and I'm not sure. I'm not a doctor, and I know the others know the details better than I. But the cancer, I think, did progress. He did have a liver transplant about 2 years ago, which didn't apparently take. And
well, I think it bought him some time.
It did buy him some time. He survived much longer than the doctors said that he would survive. Steve, there's a very dramatic picture on the front page at apple.com now. Steve leaves behind his wife, who he's been married to for, I think, 15 years, something like that, and he has several children, and I'm sure they're devastated. You know, and we talked quite at great length when he resigned about his impact on the industry, but you just can't overstate what he accomplished. Not himself a technologist, and yet he seemed to have a real deep understanding, not only of technology but of the people who use it, and a real concern and interest in the people who use it. That they get the best technology, the best design, and that they be able to use it in ways that could really make a difference. And I think without him, I don't know if the technology industry has such a human side to it, frankly. He always was absolutely committed to making it accessible to everybody. And starting with the Apple II computer, which, of course, Wozniak designed, but Steve Jobs made a successful product out of it. The iPod, the iPhone, changed the music industry with iTunes. The Macintosh is probably his best legacy, a computer which really did bring personal computing to everybody.
You can dispute what you think of Apple and what its products are, but there's a couple of things you can't dispute. One is that he was a committed visionary. He had an idea of how computing should work best for people, and he made it happen. And the other thing you can't argue with is that it was a success. Apple is the most valuable technology company. The iPhone and the iPod are widespread runaway hits. And as you say, the MacBook has brought personal computing to millions of people. So you can say, well, I don't like OS X or I don't like this or that about the iPhone, but the man was a visionary and was a success.
Was your sense, Kevin, of Steve? I met Steve once, spent a weekend with him in a kind of an unusual situation where he had not yet come back to Apple. He was at Pixar still, but it was 95, I think. So he was, kind of on the verge of going back to Apple. And had clearly was spending a lot of time wandering in the wilderness, thinking about Apple and what Apple had done wrong. And a couple of things that struck me about Steve: he was a very generous and father. I watched him with his little children at the time, and a very loving father. Loved his wife deeply, but was also driven. I've never seen anybody with such energy, drive, and interest in this subject. And I remember him talking late at night passionately about what Apple had done wrong, about where Apple had taken a wrong turn. He believed that Apple had a huge advantage in 1984 where it came out with the Macintosh and let that advantage slip, that by 10 years later when Microsoft came out with Windows 3.1, he said Apple had lost its lead. He was not happy about the clones. You could tell he was still thinking about Apple and running Apple. You could also tell that he believed that he was one of the smartest guys in the room, and I'll tell you what, I think he was in many ways. Just a brilliant guy. You were talking about a Steve Jobs presentation? This back when he was with Next. Did he seem driven at that time to you, Kevin?
Yes, no, very much. And he had this very clear vision of, again, a beautiful computer attached to the network that would understand documents completely, would replace documents and paper with the screen, and would connect to everyone else. So that was we kind of forget the Next era because it didn't take off in the same way that the Mac did, but by being the computer that made that networking available, it was the computer the web was written on. That's part of his legacy too, was that Tim Berners-Lee was easily able to put together a networking stack on these devices, plug the things together and get that working. And that sensibility came back to Apple when Steve came back as well. And his he always had this, as you said, this driven vision. Mm-hmm. So the first project I worked on at Apple was a small one. It was the DVD player controller, the app that controlled the DVD player. And my colleague who was working on the visual design of that kept getting these continual messages back and forth from Steve saying, no, it's not right yet. It looks wrong. I want it to be more physical. I want it to be more shiny. I want it to look like metal. And eventually he got sent a photograph of Steve's watch strap, I think it was, to just say, this is what the metal should look like. Make it like this. And that was when he brought this sort of brush metal thing into the user interface, and that then spread through the design. But the point was, it was like, I have an aesthetic idea for this and how I want this to work, and I will keep iterating with you on that until it works. Yep. Another example was a colleague of mine there, Tom Dowdy, who's also recently deceased, was working on the iTunes visualizer. You remember the thing that does those trippy patterns. And he so he had a whole bunch of different generators and processors and color palettes and things that he was putting together to make different things. And he had a meeting with Steve where they sat there and went through all of them. And Steve was saying, yes, no, that doesn't work. That's not beautiful enough. That's too obvious. And actually went through adjusted the aesthetic of all these different generators so that the stuff that came out of that visualizer fit his aesthetic vision as well. So he was definitely someone who always cared about detail. And certainly every Apple executive that you would sit down and have a drink with would tell you Steve stories and tell you things.
We've heard quite a few. Vic Goodrotra shared one on Google Plus when Steve resigned in August of being at religious services on a Sunday, and this phone ringing. He didn't recognize the number, so he didn't pick up. Vic was at the time in charge of all of Google's iPhone apps. After services, he looked at the phone. It was from Steve Jobs, the call was. It was a message saying, this is Steve. I've got something very urgent to talk to you about. Call me immediately. Vic, of course, called Steve on a Sunday and explained. He said, Steve, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize the number, and I was in services. Steve said, no, Vic, don't worry. The only time you should interrupt religious services is if God's calling. And proceeded to say, look, there's a problem with the yellow gradient on the O in your Google app on the iPhone. I've assigned a designer to fix it. I hope that's okay with you. And fix it. Yeah, it's okay, but it just shows that on a Sunday, Steve Jobs is looking at the color gradients of the O on Google's app on the iPhone, not even his own apps
Yes.
on the iPhone. Every detail. He chose everything from the T-shirts sold in the Apple store to the leather in the Apple bus that took its employees from San Francisco to Cupertino to, of course, the look and feel of every Apple product. So just a man who had a vision and had the energy to pursue that vision nonstop. Steve is left behind by his wife, Laureen. They married in '91. He has 2 sons and daughters by Laureen, and then also a daughter, Lisa, who was born in 1978. He supported her for some time. It was in a relationship that he didn't acknowledge for a long time. But Lisa and her mother lived close to the Apple campus in Palo Alto, and eventually they reconciled. And that weekend that I spent with Steve in '94, all 4 of his children, his son, his 2 daughters, and Laureen, were there. Actually, I think he might have only had a son and a daughter at the time. But also Lisa was there, and they had reconciled. And as I said, I think that he did treat family very importantly, and I think that was one of the reasons he did resign in August. I'm sure that he realized that his health was taking a turn for the worse, and he wanted to have time with them, time to spend with them, and not with his beloved Apple. Employees tell of Steve's last few weeks at Apple in August, walking around the Apple campus, talking with Tim Cook, pointing things out, almost in ill health, but almost as an effort to say, see, I'm here, I'm still here, and I'm telling Tim what to do when I'm not here. And, of course, his last public appearance was just a few months earlier in front of the Cupertino City Council, where he asked for their permission to build a new Apple campus, a campus that will in many ways be his final legacy to Apple Computer. Just an amazing campus.
He was an example of visionary leading the way and keeping it from being decision by committee. So many companies and so many products suffer from decisions by committee that make them become average, that bring down. And the danger of doing that is if you're not good at it, your company, your product or your company is only going to be as good as you are.
Never a focus group at Apple. Never ask somebody what they think. He knew, and I think that's the auteur theory. You know that a committee can really take the heart and soul out of something, and that having one person who has that vision, surrounding himself with great people like Johnny Ive, and of course Steve Wozniak. He had so many great engineers worked at Apple. Andy Hertzfeld, Bill Atkinson.
Andy's folklore.org site is great if you want to. He turned it into a book as well, but there's the stories of how they put the Macintosh there are wonderful. I really recommend that as something to read.
They've been collecting for a long time at folklore.org memories of the Apple Macintosh and of Steve in a lot of ways. I think it was Jeff Raskin who had the original idea for a computer for the rest of us. The late Jeff Raskin, who said that Steve Jobs would have made a great king of France. At least that's in his Wikipedia article. And I think that says something about, of course, his dominant personality, but also his regal point of view.
There was something of the court about Apple, certainly, and that was, the way that it wasn't always that Steve would have the vision, but he would have, as you say, would be the decider, like the story I was saying about the choosing all the individual pieces and the attention to detail. But you would have the different product groups building things and then showing them to Steve for approval. And there was certainly, bits of that were not always great, because you'd have different groups competing with each other, building similar things and keeping secrets from each other. But the final decision of how they built the products and what went out was definitely filtered through Steve deciding, yes, this is good, this is bad, we should do this, we shouldn't do this. So that sort of clarity of vision was something that was very successful. And there are always things you can say, I wish he hadn't done that, I wish he had kept HyperCard, or there are bits and pieces that you could second guess the decisions, but he was certainly capable of changing his mind and choosing a different direction over time, and seeing something coming and saying, oh, we should change to support this. The original iTunes thing was an example of that. The Macs had not shipped with CD burners. There'd been some third-party ones, but that had something that Apple had seen at all, and suddenly they were taking off on Windows. And Steve was very much like outflanking that by saying, okay, we need to ship CD burners, but we need to make the CD burning experience both useful and something that the record companies are comfortable with. We need to build it in such a way that we can remix, rip, mix, and burn CDs, and find a way to bring the labels on board too. And the work that they did to actually put that deal together with all the major labels was completely groundbreaking at the time. You can think about what else was going on.
Here's some video from a WWDC. Steve had just come back to Apple. This is a really good example of how thoughtful Steve was. He basically is attacked by a developer in the audience, and instead of coming back with a flip comment or an angry comment, he actually, and you'll see, takes his time, sits down, thinks, and gives a very reasoned, thoughtful response.
You're a bright and influential man.
Here it comes.
It's sad and clear that on several counts you've discussed, you don't know what you're talking about. I would like, for example, for you to express in clear terms how, say, Java, in any of its incarnations, addresses the ideas embodied in OpenDoc. And when you're finished with that, perhaps you could tell us what you personally have been doing for the last 7 years.
You can hear people saying, ouch. But watch, he thinks, he pauses, and I think he gives a brilliant answer.
You can please some of the people some of the time, but one of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that people like this gentleman are right in some areas. I'm sure that there are some things OpenDoc does, probably even more that I'm not familiar with, that nothing else out there does. And I'm sure that you can make some demos, maybe a small commercial app that demonstrates those things. The hardest thing is, how does that fit in to a cohesive, larger vision that's going to allow you to sell $8 billion, $10 billion of product a year? And one of the things I've always found is that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And I've made this mistake probably more than anybody else in this room. And I've got the scar tissue to prove it. And I know that it's the case. And as we have tried to come up with a strategy and a vision for Apple, it started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? Not starting with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what awesome technology we have, and then how are we going to market that.
I think that's very important, and it's something a lot of companies still don't do.
To take. I remember with the laser writer, we built the world's first small laser printers, you know, and there was awesome technology in that box. We had the first Canon laser printing, cheap laser printing engine in the world, in the United States here at Apple. We had a very wonderful printer controller that we designed. We had Adobe's PostScript software in there. We had Apple Talk in there. Just awesome technology in the box. And I remember seeing the first printout come out of it and just picking it up and looking at it and thinking, you know, we can sell this. Because you don't have to know anything about what's in that box. All we have to do is hold this up and go, do you want this? And if you can remember back to 1984, before laser printers, it was pretty startling to see that. People went, wow, yes. And that's where Apple's got to get back to. And, you know, I'm sorry that OpenDoc's a casualty along the way, and I readily admit there are many things in life that I don't have the faintest idea what I'm talking about. So I apologize for that too. But there's a whole lot of people working super, super hard right now at Apple. You know, Avi, John, Garino, Fred. I mean, the whole team is working, burning the midnight oil, trying to, and people, you know, hundreds of people below them, to execute on some of these things, and they're doing their best. And I think that what we need to do, and some mistakes will be made, by the way. Some mistakes will be made along the way. That's good, because at least some decisions are being made along the way. And we'll find the mistakes, we'll fix them. And I think what we need to do is support that team going through this very important stage as they work their butts off. They're all getting calls, being offered 3 times as much money to go do this, do that, the valley's hot. None of them are leaving. And I think we need to support them and see them through this and write some damn good applications to support Apple out in the market. That's my own point of view. Mistakes will be made. Some people will be pissed off. Some people will not know what they're talking about. But I think it is so much better than where things were not very long ago. And I think we're going to get there.
Steve Jobs.
I think we've got time for just...
Speaking at a Mactopia conference shortly after his return to Apple in 1997, that of all the clips I've seen, and I've been looking at a lot of Steve Jobs clips over the last couple of months, encapsulates, I think, his vision and his humanity better than anything. I mean,
it almost seems like he is, at that point, determining the philosophy that's going to guide him
exactly
for the rest of his life.
Exactly. Any thoughts, Kevin?
I think that's right. That was the clip that came to mind immediately for me as well. I mean, the other one being his commencement speech, which
we'll
I'm sure you'll play later. But what that showed was that, as you said, he'd been thinking about this a long time. He'd already had 3 attempts at building a computer at that point, and he was going back to Apple to say, "We're going to turn this upside down again." And there's a bit later on where he says, "I have these ideas about networking and building a computer that is connected over the network all the time and doesn't, basically giving the whole cloud pitch in '97, which was completely revolutionary, not completely attainable at that point, but very clear the way he'd been thinking about this." And that was always the way he'd always take these different technology things and say, what does that make possible? How do you work back from that, as he said there? And that is amazing. There's some very good stuff in the Triumph of the Nerds documentary that Bob Cringely made.
Yeah.
If you can dig clips out of that, I'd recommend that, because that was a I think that was again made during the next time, but he was talking about his first time through at Apple.
The first tenure, and it was a very different Steve Jobs that came back to Apple, I think. He ran up the pirate flag on the Apple campus to do the Macintosh, was forced out by the Apple board who felt that the Macintosh was the wrong product, that they should be continuing with their cash cow, the Apple II, and they were unhappy with Steve. John Sculley, the man he brought in to run Apple, ended up running Apple almost into the ground, followed by Michael Spindler and Gil Amelio, and just a series of bad errors, including allowing clone Macintoshes to be made. When Steve came back in 1997, it was a company that was very close to going out of business. And Steve had learned, I think, how to manage. He'd learned a different style. He came back as a more seasoned executive. I think that time spent away from Apple was really very important.
It seems like he learned what he was good at and what he wasn't. Not necessarily humbled, but sort of it was a check of, well, I'm not invulnerable.
Right.
It was his time in the wilderness.
And that's what you see in this clip that we just played. Is a very different. It is time in the wilderness. This is if another clip that I think it probably best reflects Steve's feelings prior to his death. It is 6 years old. He recorded it in 1995 at a Stanford commencement address. This is again before he went back to Apple. But he had recently learned of his pancreatic cancer. And, there's a tradition, Randy Pausch's very famous last lecture is part of that tradition of asking a professor towards the end of his career to give a lecture that is your last lecture, the lecture that has everything you've learned in your career. And I think for many reasons, Steve probably thought of this as his last lecture. He was going to go on and do many, many great things after this. I said 95. This is 2005. I'm sorry. Steve Jobs and his Stanford commencement address of 6 years ago. This is from Stanford University.
This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference. My second story is about love and loss. I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life. Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And for the first year or so, things went well. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. And so at 30, I was out, and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I really didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for screwing up so badly. I was a very public failure, and I even thought about running away from the valley. But something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. The turn of events at Apple had not changed that one bit. I'd been rejected, but I was still in love. And so I decided to start over. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next, another company named Pixar, and fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer animated feature film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next, and I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Lorene and I have a wonderful family together. I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking and don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking. Don't settle. My third story is about death. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, "If you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." It made an impression on me, and since then, for the past 33 years, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. My doctor advised me to go home and get my affairs in order, which is doctor's code for prepare to die. It means to try and tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means to say your goodbyes. I lived with that diagnosis all day. Later that evening, I had a biopsy where they stuck an endoscope down my throat, through my stomach and into my intestines, put a needle into my pancreas and got a few cells from the tumor. I was sedated, but my wife, who was there, told me that when they viewed the cells under a microscope, the doctors started crying because it turned out to be a very rare form of pancreatic cancer that is curable with surgery. I had the surgery, and thankfully, I'm fine now. This was the closest I've been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. Having lived through it, I can now say this to you with a bit more certainty than when death was a useful but purely intellectual concept. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you. But someday, not too long from now, you will gradually become the old and be cleared away. Sorry to be so dramatic, but it's quite true. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. When I was young, there was an amazing publication called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was one of the Bibles of my generation. It was created by a fellow named Stuart Brand, not far from here in Menlo Park, and he brought it to life with his poetic touch. This was in the late 60s, before personal computers and desktop publishing, so it was all made with typewriters, scissors, and Polaroid cameras. It was sort of like Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along. It was idealistic, overflowing with neat tools and great notions. Stuart and his team put out several issues of the Whole Earth Catalog, and then, when it had run its course, they put out a final issue. It was the mid-1970s, and I was your age. On the back cover of their final issue was a photograph of an early morning country road, the kind you might find yourself hitchhiking on if you were so adventurous. Beneath it were the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." It was their farewell message as they signed off. Stay hungry, stay foolish. And I have always wished that for myself. And now, as you graduate to begin anew, I wish that for you. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you all very much.
Steve Jobs at the Stanford commencement in June of 2005. Stay hungry, stay foolish. And, he had 6 more years after that. But I have to think that the resignation letter he sent to the Apple board in August of this year, just 2 months ago, was his way of saying, I'm going to put my affairs in order, that he knew, he must have known. And now I think about the Apple event yesterday, I think that those guys must have had some sense that Steve was very ill. Yeah. Tim Cook's release said that this happened earlier today. Steve Jobs, for those who are just tuning in, passed away today at the age of 56. Probably complications from that pancreatic cancer he referred to earlier. He had a Whipple procedure a few years ago, liver transplant a year or 2 after that, and of course it was pretty apparent after that liver transplant that he wasn't doing well. He did soldier on, though, and continued to do new products, to continue to work at Apple. I remember the 2008 WWDC keynote where he looked so painfully thin. Apple said at the time that he had the flu. But I think at the time we were thinking it was probably related to the Whipple, which can make it difficult to take nutrition, to get the nutrition value out of your food.
And he probably did have the flu on top of it.
And he may have been sick as well. Certainly. Absolutely. But that also was 3 years ago, and he has managed to continue to run Apple. We took some time off. Tim Cook ran the company during that 6-month leave of absence. It was at that time that Steve underwent a liver transplant, April 2009, in Memphis, Tennessee. Apple gave him a second medical leave of absence 2 years, or about a year and a half after that, early this year, January. And Tim Cook once again in charge, and he resigned from Apple August 24th, 2011. Tim Cook taking the job of CEO, current CEO. Steve was chairman of the board, but of course I imagine he probably didn't go to too many board meetings over the last couple of months.
Bill Gates has written a statement saying, "I'm truly saddened to learn of Steve Jobs' death. Melinda and I extend our sincere condolences to his family and friends, to everyone Steve has touched through his work. Steve and I first met nearly 30 years ago and have been colleagues, competitors, and friends over the course of more than half our lives. The world rarely sees someone who has had the profound impact Steve has had, the effects of which will be felt for many generations to come. For those of us lucky enough to get to work with him, it's been an insanely great honor. I will miss Steve immensely." Again, Bill Gates writing that statement. They were often seen as the polar opposites, the competitors, the battlers, the good versus evil, and of course good and evil being whichever side you were on.
Right. I think, though, they had huge respect for each other, and in their later years, that All Things D joint interview that they did a couple of years ago, they clearly had an affection for each other. They were both pioneers, and by this time, both kind of could look back as elder statesmen of the personal computer industry. And I think that they probably had more in common than they had separately. This letter from Apple, this email from Apple, Apple CEO Tim Cook sent this to all Apple employees. Team, I have some very sad news to share with all of you. Steve, this is we got this, by the way, from an Apple employee who passed this along to us. Steve passed away earlier today. Apple has lost a visionary and creative genius, and the world has lost an amazing human being. Those of us who have been fortunate enough to know and work with Steve have lost a dear friend and inspiring mentor. Steve leaves behind a company that only he could have built, and his spirit will be forever the foundation of Apple. Tim Cook goes on to write, "We are planning a celebration of Steve's extraordinary life for Apple employees that will take place soon. If you would like to share your thoughts, memories, and condolences in the interim, you can email rememberingsteve@apple.com. No words can adequately express our sadness at Steve's death or our gratitude for the opportunity to work with him. We will honor his memory by dedicating ourselves to continuing the work he loved so much." From the Jobs family, this statement: "Steve died peacefully today, surrounded by his family. In his public life, Steve was known as a visionary. In his private life, he cherished his family. We are thankful to the many people who have shared their wishes and prayers during the last year of Steve's illness. A website will be provided for those who wish to offer tributes and memories. We are grateful for the support and kindness of those who share our feelings for Steve. We know many of you will mourn with us, and we ask that you respect our privacy during our time of grief." That statement from his family. Of course, he's survived by his wife of 10 years, Lorene. I'm sorry, 20 years, Lorene, and his 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. Flags are at half-mast on the Cupertino campus right now of Apple Computer. And I would not be surprised to see that employees gathering there outside. I'm sure that there are many in the area who will also go. Certainly that's somewhere I would like to be right now. Steve Jobs was a vital part of the industry that we love so much, and a man who made it a joy to be a computer and technology user. And his greatest legacy may end up being the iPad, which has transformed computing. And is really the computer for the rest of us that Steve always wanted to build. Do you feel that way, Kevin Marks? Do you think that the iPad is something Steve really saw as his crowning glory?
I think he always put his energy into the projects he was working on at the time, and to surpass the ones before. So, as this is the last thing that he worked on closely, I'm sure that it'll be seen that way. Yeah. But you have to look at the whole. He's so interwoven with the history of computing. I'm not sure you can unpick any of it. It all builds on what went before.
It did. Absolutely. And you mentioned, we were watching that Steve Jobs talking about OpenDoc at that developers conference at Mactopia. And you mentioned in the chat room, and I think it's true, that people forget the laser writer. What a revolution that was. I mean, first he did the Macintosh, then he made it possible to do quality desktop publishing from a personal computer. That was unheard of. A real revolution. If you're just joining us, word came today from Apple. Steve Jobs passed away this morning with his family. 56 years old. We don't know what the final illness was, but of course we do know he had been very ill for some time.
Of course, that email that you read out is also now up on the press site at apple.com/PR. That's sort of their public statement as well.
Right. You know, it really does. It must have been very difficult yesterday, now that I think of it, for Tim, who did seem somewhat subdued, and Phil Schiller and Eddie Q to do that product launch, knowing, as they must have, that Steve wasn't doing very well.
Yeah, I mean, having been through similar cancer situations with relatives this close to that happening, you know it's coming.
Yeah. Some real tributes all over the media. I'm seeing CNN is full-time covering this, as is MSNBC, Fox News. It's a big story to the world at large, and of course every website with tributes, pictures of Steve.
I like what Boing Boing is doing. Instead
Boing
of some
Mac
long,
style.
pre-written biography of his life, they've skinned their site to look like a classic Mac OS.
With the Finder and the folders and the files and the I remember very well the first time I saw Lisa. I was living and working in San Jose at a radio station there, and there was an Apple store, and they had the Lisa in the window, and it looked so cool and so neat and so exciting. And then I saw the price tag, and I thought, well, that's a shame because I'll never be able to get one. I had just recently convinced the radio station that I worked for to buy a Fortune system, which was a multi-user computer system based on CP/M, I think, and we had a graphical computer, CP/M computer called a North Star Advantage that I was able to do some programming with and so forth. And those had been very expensive, but nothing like an Apple Lisa. So I just looked at it and hung my head and thought, well, that's not for me. And I think even Steve realized that, and that's why he raised the pirate flag on that building and on the Apple campus and said, we're going to do something that's more accessible, that's easier to use, something that has the spirit of the Lisa, but something people can afford. And came up with the Macintosh in 1984 and really transformed computing. And even then, it was expensive. It was $2,500, but I remember going to Macy's. They released the Macintosh, I think it was January 1984. Maybe it was a little later. And I remember going in March. And with it, they call those of us who bought Macs in the first 100 days, 100-day Mac owners. And going within that first 100 days to Macy's, because I could use my Macy's card and buy that first Macintosh computer for $2,500. It had one floppy. And the floppy didn't hold very much. I think it was 160K. It had a megabyte of video memory. I think it was a 3M computer, wasn't it, Kevin? It had a megabyte of on-screen memory. It had a megabyte of RAM and a 1 MIPS CPU, a 68,000 CPU. So for the time, it was a very advanced machine, and it needed all that power to do the graphics that it was doing on screen, the bitmapped graphics. Nobody had done anything like that. All we'd seen up to that point was green text on a black screen, and maybe some very simple graphics based on the ASCII character set. And the Macintosh came along, brought the Lisa user interface, the folder and file system, and it was a revolution. Yeah, Boing Boing really nailed it, I think, on this one. Beautiful.
Well, you're going to see a lot of very long and very well done biographies, retrospectives, because companies do this. Media companies do this. They prepare obit files on all major people. It's not just Steve Jobs, but they've got one for Bill Gates. They've got one for presidents, and
it's actually quite controversial, wasn't it? Bloomberg that accidentally released their obituary.
You got to be careful
Steve Jobs
ahead
of time.
Staging those things.
Yeah.
But what I like about what Boing Boing did is they obviously thought about it ahead of time and said, instead of just writing what everyone else is writing, we'll do something it's a little more poignant.
Chat room is passing along the Think Different video tribute from YouTube. This is Fuego7 who put this up pretty darn quickly. If you can pick up the YouTube on my screen, and we'll play that for you. See how high resolution we can make this. This is the best.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
I'm going to see if I can find it. There's a video of Steve introducing that Think Different concept to Apple.
An annoyance to grammar nerds everywhere.
Yes, it's not think differently, but it was actually a brilliant ad campaign, and that's the text you hear in the background. But of course, with Gizmodo put pictures of Steve Jobs to it. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits.
Just hindsight to me, but it almost feels like that was his aspiration, was to be the kind of person that those words would apply to.
Yeah. I remember watching this video of Steve Jobs, again, showing what a brilliant marketeer he was. This is a video of him. I can't remember when this is. He's pretty young. I don't know what team he's speaking to. I believe this is right after he came back to Apple, and he's introducing a new Apple campaign. Here is Steve Jobs talking about Think Different.
To me, marketing is about values. This is a very complicated world. It's a very noisy world. And we're not going to get a chance to get people to remember much about us. No company is. And so we have to be really clear on what we want them to know about us. Now, Apple, fortunately, is one of the half a dozen best brands in the whole world. Right up there with Nike, Disney, Coke, Sony. It is one of the greats of the greats, not just in this country, but all around the globe. And but even a great brand needs investment and caring if it's going to retain its relevance and vitality. And the Apple brand has clearly suffered from neglect in this area in the last few years. And we need to bring it back. The way to do that is not to talk about speeds and feeds. It's not to talk about MIPS and megahertz. It's not to talk about why we're better than Windows. The dairy industry tried for 20 years to convince you that milk was good for you. It's a lie, but they tried anyway. And the sales were going like this. And then they tried Got Milk, and the sales are going like this.
Shorts on.
Got Milk doesn't even talk about the product. Matter of fact, it focuses on the absence of the product. But the best example of all, and one of the greatest jobs of marketing the universe has ever seen is Nike. Remember, Nike sells a commodity. They sell shoes. And yet, when you think of Nike, you feel something different than a shoe company. In their ads, as you know, they don't ever talk about the product. They don't ever tell you about their air soles and why they're better than Reebok's air soles. What does Nike do in their advertising? They honor great athletes, and they honor great athletics. That's who they are. That's what they are about. Apple spends a fortune on advertising. You'd never know it. You'd never know it. So,
this
when
is
I got
Steve
here,
talking.
Apple just fired their agency. They were doing a competition with 23 agencies that, 4 years from now to pick one. And we blew that up, and
in 1997.
We hired Shaipe, the ad agency that I was fortunate enough to work with years ago. We created some award-winning work, including the commercial voted the best ad ever made in 1984 by advertising professionals. And we started working about 8 weeks ago. And the question we asked was, our customers want to know who is Apple and what is it that we stand for? Where do we fit in this world? And what we're about isn't making boxes for people to get their jobs done, although we do that well. We do that better than almost anybody in some cases. But Apple's about something more than that. Apple, at the core, its core value, is that we believe that people with passion can change the world for the better. That's what we believe. And we've had the opportunity to work with people like that. We've had an opportunity to work with people like you, with software developers, with customers who have done it in some big and some small ways. And we believe that in this world, people can change it for the better. And that those people that are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that actually do. And so what we're going to do in our first brand marketing campaign in several years is to get back to that core value. A lot of things have changed. The market's a totally different place than it was a decade ago. And Apple's totally different, and Apple's place in it is totally different. And believe me, the products and the distribution strategy and manufacturing are totally different, and we understand that. But values and core values, those things shouldn't change. The things that Apple believed in at its core are the same things that Apple really stands for today. And so we wanted to find a way to communicate this. And what we have is something that I'm very moved by. It honors those people who have changed the world. Some of them are living, some of them are not. But the ones that aren't, as you'll see, you know that if they ever used a computer, it would have been a Mac.
This was very controversial, of course, at the time.
The theme of the campaign is think different. It's the people, honoring the people who think different and who move this world forward. And it is what we are about. It touches the soul of this company. So I'm going to go ahead and roll it, and I hope that you feel the same way about it I do.
And, of course, he plays the thing. I'll let this go, because this is a great ad.
Here's to the crazy ones. The misfits. The rebels. The troublemakers. The round pegs in the square holes. The ones who see things differently.
That's Richard Branson.
They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them, but the only thing you can't do is ignore them. Because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
It's a brilliant marketing campaign. And, of course, that's what Steve Jobs was best at. Steve was a dedicated vegan, a fervent vegan, as was his wife, Lorena. In fact, I think it was probably Lorene that got him to be a vegan. I'm not sure, though. I think he always was a vegetarian. And he and Lorena at one point started a business, I remember, of vegan frozen food or vegan food that you could buy in a grocery store. Kevin, you gave us a link to the Triumph of the Nerds clip. I'm going to see if I can scroll back through the chat and find that, because I would like to play it. We're seeing a number of tweets come across. Apparently, Woz will be on Nightline tonight to talk about Steve Jobs. We had Woz on TWiT shortly after Jobs resigned, I think the following Sunday. And he really was very reluctant to say anything about Steve, good or bad. He hadn't really been in touch with Steve. But I think that there's no question that those are the two guys who are going to be, their names will be tied together in history forever. Because, of course, it was the two of them that founded Apple Computer, along with a couple of other guys who people don't really remember. But we probably should. I'm trying to remember their names right now. Kevin, any idea? It was
Mike Markula.
Mike Markula. There you go.
And
Ron,
Arthur Rock was the VC guy.
Yeah, it was Ben Rock, but it was well, the chat room. I don't really remember. Let me see if I can find this. Wayne, that's it.
That's it.
Yeah, Ron Wayne.
Wayne, right.
All right, let me play this Triumph of the Nerds. I've got your link right here. I'm not sure how long we should continue with this. I have to take a break. I'm going to go on CNN in about 10 minutes. Do you guys, what do you want to do? Do you want to keep talking? Or, I mean, there's just kind of, for me, there's a huge amount of sadness over this, of course. And I think for everybody who followed Steve Jobs and loved what Apple was doing. Just very powerful memories, and sad stuff. So should I just play this from the beginning? This is on YouTube. Kevin, this clip that you sent along of Triumph of the Nerds?
The Windows software system that ended the alliance between Microsoft and IBM.
Yeah, should I start here?
Start about 3 minutes in.
Yeah, I don't care that much about Bill Gates at this point.
Yeah.
There's of course the 1984 commercial that introduced the Macintosh.
About 3 minutes he starts talking about Steve.
Okay.
And he interviews a bunch of people. It's pretty good.
This is a documentary Robert X. Cringely did. In fact, there he is. For I think it was for PBS. Man, this must be 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Triumph of the Nerds. See if I can get it to play. Sometimes it doesn't like it when I
follow his direction. With this guy, we're not talking about someone driven by the profit motive and a desire for an opulent retirement at the age of 40. No, we're talking holy war. We're talking rivers of blood and fields of dead martyrs to the cause of greater computing. We're talking about a guy who sees the personal computer as his tool for changing the world. We're talking about Steve Jobs.
Hi, I'm Steve Jobs. When I wasn't sure what the word charisma meant, I met Steve Jobs, and then I knew.
Steve Jobs is on my eternal heroes list. There's nothing he can ever do to get off it.
He wanted you to be great. And he wanted you to create something that was great. And he was going to make you do that.
He's also obnoxious. And this comes from his high standards. He has extremely high standards, and he has no patience with people who don't either share those standards or perform to them.
And I'm also one of these people that I don't really care about being right, you know. I just care about success.
Steve Jobs had co-founded Apple Computer in 1976. The first popular personal computer, the Apple II, was a hit and made Steve Jobs one of the biggest names in a brand new industry. At the height of Apple's early success, in December 1979, Jobs, then all of 24, had a privileged invitation to visit Xerox PARC.
And they showed me really 3 things. But I was so blinded by the first one that I didn't even really see the other 2. One of the things they showed me was object-oriented programming. They showed me that, but I didn't even see that. The other one they showed me was really a networked computer system. They had over 100 Alto computers, all networked, using email, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't even see that. I was so blinded by the first thing they showed me, which was the graphical user interface. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever seen in my life. Now, remember, it was very flawed. What we saw was incomplete. They'd done a bunch of things wrong, but we didn't know that at the time. It's still, though, they had the germ of the idea was there, and they'd done it very well. And within, 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this someday.
It was a turning point. Jobs decided this was the way forward for Apple.
He came back and, I almost said asked, but the truth is demanded that his entire programming team get a demo of the Smalltalk system. And the then head of the Science Center asked me to give the demo because Steve specifically asked for me to give the demo. And I said, no way. I had a big argument with the Xerox executives telling them that they were about to give away the kitchen sink. And I said I would only do it if I were ordered to do it, because then, of course, would be their responsibility. And that's what they did.
The mouse is a pointing device that moves a cursor around the display screen.
Adele and her colleagues showed the Apple programmers an Alto machine running a graphical user interface.
A selected window displays above other windows, much like placing a piece of paper on top of a stack on a desk.
The visitors from Apple saw a computer that was designed to be easy to use, a machine that anybody could operate and find friendly, even the French.
Choose one.
I think mostly what we got in that hour and a half was inspiration. And basically just sort of a bolstering of our convictions that a more graphical way to do things would make this business computer more accessible.
After an hour looking at demos, they understood our technology and what it meant more than any Xerox executive understood it after years of showing it to them.
Basically, they were copier heads that just had no clue about a computer or what it could do. And so they just grabbed defeat from the greatest victory in the computer industry. Xerox could have owned the entire computer industry today. Could have been, a company 10 times its size. Could have been IBM. Could have been the IBM of the 90s. Could have been the Microsoft of the 90s.
For Steve Jobs, the road to Damascus passed through Palo Alto. He persuaded the Apple board to invest in technology copying what he'd seen at Xerox PARC, his instrument of change. They hired 100 engineers and started developing a new PC codenamed Lisa. But there were problems. The Lisa didn't work properly, and its price tag was heading toward $10,000, way too much for the average PC buyer. Jobs' domineering style drove everyone nuts, too, so the board ousted him from his own pet project.
I brooded for a few months. But it was not very long after that it really occurred to me that if we didn't do something here, the Apple II was running out of gas. And we needed to do something with this technology fast, or else Apple might cease to exist as the company that it was.
Jobs got his answer from Jeff Raskin, Apple employee number 31. Raskin's idea was a $600 computer, as easy to use as a toaster, codenamed Macintosh after America's favorite Apple. Jobs liked the price, but not Raskin's design ideas. So Steve took over the Macintosh project, determined to make it a cheaper Lisa.
And so I formed a small team to do the Macintosh, and we were on a mission from God, to save Apple.
While Jobs pursued his Mac mission, he needed a more orthodox chief executive to run the company, a respectable face who could sell to corporate America. He chose Pepsi-Cola executive John Sculley. Sculley refused. Leave Pepsi for a 4-year-old company that had been set up in a garage? Are you serious? But it was hard saying no to Steve Jobs.
It's an interesting period because it lays the groundwork for understanding what I think was the brilliance of Steve Jobs. He wasn't the guy who invented it. Steve Wozniak invented the Apple computer. And as you saw there, Xerox invented the mouse and the Windows. But Steve Jobs' brilliance was seeing how to take those inventions and make the most out of them.
I think that's it. I think that's what we've said a few times already, is that he was excellent at recognizing great work and encouraging people to do better. I think that quote from Larry Tesler in there is wonderful, where he said, Steve wanted you to do great things and he would make you do that. I think that was a very good summation of the man. Sorry?
Sorry, I think we're going to have to wrap it up here because we have to do a Skype test. Leo's going to go on to CNN. So we're gonna let you go. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you. This has been great for me too.
Oh, good. It's excellent to get your insight on this, and take care. We will get you back to do a triangulation that won't be interrupted by immense breaking news next time. But
I'm so glad that Kevin could be here, because not only did he work for Apple, he's worked for everybody, but he's just a thoughtful fellow. And I apologize for blowing your triangulation, Kevin, but
not at all.
Tunnelvision.tv is where Kevin does a podcast, which used to be on TWiT, a great show, and you can watch that live. What day of the week, Kevin?
Thursdays, live on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Pacific.
Tunnelvision.tv. Thank you, Kevin. I'm sure you have your own thoughts and memories to do now.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I kind of wish Kevin's down in the South Bay. I kind of wish we were closer to Cupertino, because I sure would love to
be there.
To be there right now.
Yeah. I suspect it would be very crowded there now.
Yeah, I suspect it will be. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. I'll go watch you on CNN.
Thanks, Kevin.
I'll be on for probably a nanosecond. I don't know. I have no idea why I'm going to be on, but.
Apple headquarters in California. People are mourning there. Also, right here in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. at the Apple Store. People all over the world are mourning the loss of Steve Jobs. Leo Laporte is the host of the nationally syndicated Tech Guy radio show on Premier Radio Networks. He's the founder of his own internet-based technology network, This Week in Tech. He's interviewed Steve Jobs many times. Leo, what goes through your mind on this sad day?
You know, we were so prepared for this. We knew it was coming, and yet it's still such a shock, and it's so sad. And I'm really trying to focus on celebrating his life. This is a guy who lived his life exactly as he wanted to. Woz said that Steve exceeded every goal he ever set for himself. He's a guy who lived his dreams and changed our lives as a result.
What made him so amazing? Was it his education? Was it his family? Was it his background growing up in California? There must have been some spark there that created this genius.
What are the ingredients that make somebody like that? You know, he was a college dropout. It wasn't his education. I think there was something inside him that drove him to exceed. He didn't care what other people thought. He cared about making great stuff. And he succeeded every step of the way. He stumbled, occasionally made mistakes. He wandered in the wilderness after being fired at Apple, and yet he kept coming back. And I think it was his extraordinary drive that really made him the man he is.
Now, in your interviews with him, what was he like as a person? Was he easy to get along with? Did he like to chat? Did he talk about sports or baseball or something? Or was he simply focused on technology?
Steve was very focused. There's a famous story about him coming into a conference room and somebody starting to chat about the weekend and him saying, "Can we raise the tone of conversation here?" He was a get-to-work guy. When Steve walked in the room, it was really apparent immediately that he knew he was the smartest guy in the room. Usually, he was absolutely right. He was down to earth. And later, in the last few years, he really didn't do very many interviews. He didn't trust the press. He didn't like the press. He wanted to control, very tightly control, the image of Apple and his own image. He was a control freak in every sense of the word. And yet, he inspired us all. I mean, without Steve Jobs, you wonder, where's the excitement going to come from in this industry?
That's a good question, and I don't think anyone really appreciates that. Leo, thanks very much. Aaron Burnett is still with us.
So you know, I look at it, and I'm sitting with you, and we're talking to Kevin Marks, and I'm thinking, is it true? But it comes in again and again, and then they say AP saying it, CNN saying it, and then finally Apple saying it. So, of course, at that point, you have to believe it, as difficult.
Well, and Wall Street Journal and AP both just had breaking news: Apple reports Steve Jobs dead, but no details, no links. Apple at that point still hadn't entirely refreshed their page.
Yeah, we kept looking, and I have to say, oh, this is a beautiful image from Mark Long. Geek Girl posted this.
And Google now has a very subtle tribute. If you go to google.com, just below the search box, it says Steve Jobs and the dates, you know, of his birth and death, and a link to apple.com.
It's interesting. I saw a lot of people calling for Google to do something.
A doodle or something.
Yeah,
but a doodle would be inappropriate.
I don't think a doodle is in
but
Steve
you know,
Jobs'
this
style.
shows you, I mean, there were probably not a lot of love lost between Google and Apple towards the end. In fact, Steve Jobs very famously told a all-hands meeting at Apple that Google was stealing from them, that Google had gotten all the ideas for the Android phone from the iPhone, from Eric Schmidt's time on the Google board, and basically the Android phone was a complete and utter ripoff. He was very, very angry. But I tell you, when it comes down to it, Bill Gates, Eric Schmidt, anybody in this industry, we all owe such a big debt to Steve Jobs. And I meant what I said. I think that we should really be celebrating the life of a one-of-a-kind, a person who does not come along very often, and made a huge difference. And he could have committed his life to a lot of things. I mean, this is a guy who's not only brilliant and talented, but hugely energetic. He could have done so many things. And what he chose to do was something very near and dear to our heart, which is make technology accessible. When Steve Jobs came on the scene, the personal computer was a kit that you'd buy from the back of Popular Mechanics magazine. It wasn't something any normal person can use. Woz's Apple I was something you had to build yourself. It was made out of wood.
It was a step up from a kit.
It was a step up, but not much.
But not much.
And Steve Jobs, in the garage of his parents' house in Palo and Cupertino, was wiring motherboards. I mean, his commitment to making this stuff, not to make money. I don't believe it was to make money, but to making this stuff accessible for all of us.
I don't think he minded making money. I think he wanted to make money, but his motivation was consumer oriented. How do we change the world?
Absolutely.
How do we make things better? How do we get a product that an everyday person can use and make amazing things without having the technology get in the way? And that was always the difference. I mean, when you look at the Apple II and the Macintosh, you see the difference between Wozniak and Jobs. Wozniak was about the technology and playing with the technology and hacking it yourself and seeing what you could do. And Jobs was about getting the technology out of your way if you weren't a person like Steve Wozniak.
Yeah.
It was about, for the rest of the people who didn't want to tweak, how do we enable them to do what they want to do?
Sarah Lane joining us now. We should try to get MG too. I don't know. Is he around? Does he want to?
He's asleep in London, actually.
Oh, that's right. He's
he wrote a piece for TechCrunch about this. But yeah, it's quite late where he is.
We're trying to get Andy Anako. Jeff Jarvis joins us right now from his home in New York. Hi, Jeff.
Hey there, Leo. You've been doing great coverage. I really appreciate it.
Well, this is something near and dear to us, right? I mean,
absolutely.
We're the people, I think, in many ways, that Steve was making his stuff for.
Exactly. And, you know, it's hard to get too hyperbolic about this.
It is. It is. And
it really is.
Are we going to? No, this guy was a Michelangelo. He was a genius. He was an Edison. He was
Gutenberg, Da Vinci, Einstein. None of these is wrong. No. And you think, too, about all the sectors of life and society that he had such a big impact on. People could be amazed to have just the business impact he had, just the design, just the technology, just the cultural impact. All of these things, you know, he had a huge change in society and how we all operated.
The criticisms of Steve Jobs are usually about the fact that he didn't do things in particular, because in a way Edison is not exactly the right idea, because he didn't have his hands, he didn't invent things. But in a way Edison's exactly the right idea, because Edison didn't
He had
invent
plenty of assistants.
a lot of things.
Steve Jobs has 300
he
patents
managed
to his
people.
name.
Yeah.
I think the analogy between Jobs and Edison is actually very apt.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and you're right. And like Jobs, Edison cut across other sectors of society.
Right.
I mean, he changed society. These are the disruptors, the grand disruptors, who, as you've said, have the vision and have the dream and aren't afraid of anything.
I think we tend to want to undervalue people who do that sort of motivation and that sort of management, because there are so many hucksters out there who hide behind that. Who rise above the level of their competency and say, yes, but I'm a visionary and I'm leading, and they're really not. Yeah. Steve Jobs was one of those people who really was.
And he didn't have to say it, by the way. I don't think Steve ever said, I'm a visionary. I don't think he ever said, I'm changing the world. He did very famously say to John Scully, when he was wooing John to join Apple, and John, of course, was president of Pepsi, he said, you can continue to sell sugar water to kids, or you can come here and change the world with me. So he knew what he was doing, but he did not blow his own horn in that sense. Nevertheless, and you know, I kind of danced around it on CNN, nevertheless, there is no question, if you met Steve Jobs, you would say, this is an arrogant man. This is a man who believes he knows better than anybody else. But I think that was necessary for him.
And have you ever met anyone?
If he didn't have that attitude, he would have never achieved what he achieved.
That pushed him through.
Somebody would have said, many people would have said, we can't do this.
And I think it's telling that Wozniak drives him up to Reed College for his freshman year at Reed. They give him a piece of paper that says, Steve, these are the requirements. Now, Reed is a hippie school, and even then, I guarantee you the requirements were not particularly rigorous. Nevertheless, Steve crumples it up, says, no, I didn't come to college to fulfill any requirements. I came to learn, and took the classes he wanted to take. That's Steve Jobs. He didn't listen to anybody.
Can you think of anyone you've ever met or anyone alive now who deserved arrogance more than Steve Jobs?
Yeah, exactly. We got to, are we, yeah, we're hearing her now. I think so. Yeah.
And there are few that you can compare him to. There are Bill Gateses, and well, frankly, in the current crop,
there's not a lot.
You know, I want to start thinking about a Mark Zuckerberg or a Larry Page, but it's too early to tell.
They may prove themselves to be. They may in time. I mean, Gates, and I don't mean to take anything away from him, and this is not a contest. He didn't so much create as to commercialize, and he was brilliant at that. Right? He didn't, he didn't create the vision for technology that Steve did have. Now, in all honesty, also you have to give credit to Xerox, and you have to give credit to Steve Jobs' predecessors. You have to give credit to the creator of Helvetica Type. He did build on the shoulders of others, certainly, and they both did.
I think, though, in no case was any of the seminal products of Apple the first. It wasn't the first personal computer, the Apple II. The Macintosh wasn't the first GUI. It wasn't the first windowing computer.
Well, yeah.
The iPod wasn't the first MP3 player. The iPad wasn't the first tablet. iTunes wasn't the first music playing software. In fact, they bought software to make iTunes. In no case did he create something new out of whole cloth. In every case, he took something that was there and made it a product. He made it a world changer. And in some ways, that's an even more difficult feat if you think about it.
It wasn't about being first, it was about being best.
Best.
Yes.
Well, seeing things that other people couldn't see. I mean, he credits that calligraphy class that he just
Wasn't that a
sat
great
in
story?
on because he felt like it.
Yeah.
Because he didn't like the classes that the college was offering him, so he dropped out and decided to take calligraphy classes that he loved, and says, that's why computers look so awesome now, because of that.
He very famously on stage with Bill Gates during All Things D said, well, the problem with you, Bill, is you have no taste. and Bill Gates said, you're right. I mean, even his peers looked to Steve Jobs as a tastemaker. Andy Anako, speaking of tastemakers, he's the fresh maker, joins us. He is from the, of course, Chicago Sun-Times and our regular host on Mac Break Weekly. And the last time we were sitting around this table, Andy, was August 29th when Steve Jobs announced his retirement. I don't think any of us saw this happening this quickly.
I think mostly because we didn't want to see it happening this quickly. It was, we, as Apple fans and also fans of technology and just people of good taste, we have a relationship, I've had a relationship, can't believe I'm saying had, a relationship with Steve Jobs that was irrational and incorrect. We felt as though we knew him. We felt as though we had a relationship with him. And to some extent, we could sort of blind ourselves to the idea of, yeah, he does look weaker. He does look more frail. He looks like he now doesn't have the energy to really stand and give this presentation anymore. But somehow we feel as though, look, he's Steve Jobs. On top of everything else, he's got more money than God. There must be some way, some technology, some treatment that can extend his life. But, we knew this day was coming, and we're always like the hope of a child, hoping that it would be forestalled as long as possible.
And as Leo, you said earlier, the Whipple procedure that he went through was really amazing. My roommate at Sloan Kettering had the same procedure, and as he described everything done to his body, and then he went through liver transplant, he went through everything. I have to believe that Jobs was going through so much more pain and suffering than he ever let on, yet continued to lead his company. Such was his determination.
I think you're right. I mean, towards the end, in fact, he took a medical leave of absence at the beginning of this year, second medical leave of absence. We thought, well, this has to be it, and came back. And you're right. I must have been gritting his teeth at every step of the way. This is a very painful kind of cancer. And this is, again, another measure of this man's amazing drive. And it's not to make money. It's not even to be the best-selling product of any kind. It's to change the world. I really believe that's what moved Steve Jobs.
It really shines light on yesterday, too.
No kidding.
The fact that it was so subdued, and we were all sort of sitting here going, yeah, it just doesn't feel the same. Something's off.
It was somber.
And it was.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that this has a lot to do with that people knew that the end was near.
As we're doing our live coverage, of course, we're not seeing the video, so we didn't know how somber it was. But today, Jeff, when I played that video, edited down video of the Apple keynote,
the 80 seconds, yeah.
Everybody sounded depressed.
Yes.
And did it strike you? It struck me, and I thought, what?
No,
wow.
I think you're so right to point that out about yesterday, and it puts it in perspective. And I think those of us who said, I regret that now and feel rather silly, knowing that what they were going through. And in the sense, you'd think, well, why didn't they put it off? But no, that'd be the worst thing to have done.
Yeah, I've noticed some people in the chat room speculating, well, is this why they had the later announcement of the iPhone instead of having it in the summer? I think it'd be the opposite. If they knew that this was coming, they would have made the announcement in the summer when they knew, or at least quickly in August, rather than putting it off.
From Town Hall. It's on my screen. I don't know if you can see that, Chad. Let me pull my computer up. There's a photo that the chat room sent me. I'm not sure where it is, but it's a photo from Town Hall yesterday. Front row, aisle seat with a cloth on it, a dark cloth saying reserved, seat that was never filled. And I have to think that might have been reserved for Steve. And perhaps they hoped he would show up. Perhaps it was like the seat reserved for Elijah at Passover. Reserved for the man whose spirit hovered over that event yesterday, but perhaps his body was not capable of making it there. So, can you see that image? Because it's a very moving. There it is, and very touching. In hindsight, very touching image.
Scoble, who of course is our Zelig, he was at One Infinite Loop almost immediately taking pictures, and people were already bringing flowers there. They moved the press, he said, off the campus so as not to bother the employees. You know, you've got to believe this is just devastating for them. You know, what company has a leader like that?
Yeah, they on August 29th when he resigned, it was very sad at the Apple campus. People were just walking around, heads hung, because you know that he is the guy. I don't care what everybody says. He's handed it off. The DNA is there. You don't get a Steve Jobs. You don't get a second Steve Jobs. This is it. And I'm sure Tim Cook is a great guy. He's, from all reports, a very competent manager and a guy who's really good at the supply chain. Johnny Ive's the best designer in the world. Steve always surrounded himself with great people. The Apple Macintosh team was the most amazing team ever. And he
don't you think,
them
Leo,
to succeed.
After having left the company before, after seeing it fall down before, I've had to believe that when he came back, that he was always aware of his succession and of getting the DNA and getting the people in the company right and trained so that he could leave the company in good shape this time.
Absolutely. I have said a couple times that this is his true test right now of his management, of his ability, is how well he has been able to inculcate himself into the DNA of the people and the methods and the process. I think Nick Bilton was saying on CNN earlier, it'll be a few years before we really see the effect, and I think that's true in the larger sense. But we'll start to see over the next year or so certain decisions have to be made close to shipping time that will be made now without Steve Jobs' input.
Yeah, I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. It's that Steve created a company that he himself could succeed at. I think one of the reasons why he was ousted was that Apple was not at that time a company where somebody with Steve's kind of mind could really make it to the very, very top. So I think that a lot of people are going to be misinterpreting Apple's structure to think that Steve was creating a cult of personality where unless you belong to the Church of Steve, you couldn't make it to a high level. No, he created an environment, and this is something that's backed up by my conversations with Apple employees. Some of them have been there for about pre-Steve and since Steve, that this is just a world in which you have to be passionate about what you do. You have to believe in what you're saying. And when somebody attacks you for something you're saying, you have to have that passion to come back and say, no, you're wrong, I'm right, and here's how it's going to be. It was a no BS, fact-filled company, and that this is not a place where if you're not at least in tune with the sort of thinking that and the sort of worldview that Steve Jobs had, there was definitely going to be a ceiling beyond which you were not going to advance.
Andy, hold on that thought for a second, because you just said it was a fact-filled company, which I think is true, and there was a right way to do things. But contrast that with Google, which is which data makes every decision. What's the word you would give it? Was it heart? Was it taste? What was the word at Apple?
It's a company of humans building things for humans, and on so many levels that could sound like I'm being glib or joking, but it was never about the data. It was never about the components of a device. It was never about, hey, look at how well this benchmarks, or hey, look, we have the other companies doing something like this and we're doing this in a better way. It's always been, what is the best way to enhance people's lives with technology? What is going to be the effect of putting a better camera inside a phone? Is it going to be that people are going to go into Photoshop and put it under 100 times magnification and say, oh, look, there's less purple fringing on this item than on others. Apple is the company, though, that when they put an 8-megapixel sensor and increase the light sensitivity and increase the speed with which you can take a picture, it's not so that they can look good in a benchmark compared to the Droid Bionic. It's because when they're developing that hardware and that software, they're thinking about the father who's just seen their little kid doing something awesome, and the only camera they have is the phone in their pocket, and if they don't get the picture in 1.5 seconds, they're going to lose that memory forever. But because these engineers worked that hard, and because the management put so much support behind their work, this father has that picture of that kid that he's going to have in his wallet and on his phone for the next 30, 40 years of his life. That's what they care about. They could give a damn about the number of megapixels inside a camera.
It's really true. The measure of this is if you go on, Twitter was down for a while. The Twitter, all anybody's talking about on Twitter is this. All anybody's talking about on Facebook
is slow.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like it.
It just shows you it is about people, Andy, and the impact that this guy had on everyday people. And the depth of feeling that people are going through right now it's quite stunning. I mean, it's quite moving.
Well, I think that's a tribute to what we've been saying, which is they focused on the consumer. And so you get a personal relationship with the company because of that. And not because of marketing and not because of Steve Jobs' keynotes even so much, but because the thing you are using seemed to fit. And that's why people get so passionate about Apple, is because it fits so many lives. It doesn't fit everyone. And that's why people are so passionately against it, because they don't get it. They're like, this doesn't fit what I want to do. And they're like, yeah, but it fits 75% of the people out there.
That's really interesting. Yeah. It's true that people feel strongly about Apple, maybe not always positively, but they felt something about Apple. And, you know, you think about this. It's a box of rocks. The personal computer isn't... It has no emotion. It is a dead thing, but people feel about it.
Rare earth minerals.
Yeah, people feel about it in ways that they don't feel about many objects in their life.
Because what it inspires, Leo. I think. I mean, I confess that I've been crazed about Gutenberg lately, but I see such an incredible parallel from Gutenberg. When I read through the technology work that was needed to create printing in the first place, and he's like Jobs, he was highly secretive at first. He split things up in different workshops so no one would know what was going on. He almost got screwed, then in the end he did. But the perfection that went into printing the Bible is beyond belief. When you really analyze that everything that he did, and even the hyphens being out in the right column, and how many lines, and how it was set up, and the font, and just the perfection of it, knowing that he was talking about God, and when I'm not trying to plug myself, but when I wrote the Google book, I said that Apple was the grand exception to all rules, and a guy named Rashad Tabakawala, who's a head of strategy for Publicis, the ad agency, he said, no, you're wrong. He said Google and Apple are actually very much the same. When you see the Google search box, you see the entirety of man's digital knowledge behind it. When you hold an iPhone, you feel this zen. He said both make you feel like God. And so Apple inspired creation, and that empowers creation. In fact, both companies are highly empowering. And I think that that's a huge factor in how it changes the world. And if you go down to Occupy Wall Street, as I did last week, what do you see everywhere? Macs and iPhones, and those are the tools people are using to organize. And I think it's powerful beyond what we yet know.
You know, you said something really interesting, Jeff, and I think that people might not mention this, but Steve was a spiritual guy, but he was a Buddhist. He was very much influenced by the 60s, Bob Dylan, by the Beatles, but also by the Buddhist faith. When he and Lorene got married in '91, it was a Buddhist monk that married them. And I have this picture, which I've always kept in my mind, of Steve Jobs in his apartment in 1982. This is when he and his team were creating the Macintosh. This is how Steve lived. This man was a very wealthy man at the time. He did not have furniture. His stereo was on the floor. He was a very simple person. He did not like the frills of life. He was very focused on what he was doing. He wanted to change the world, and I think he was actually a deeply spiritual guy. He was a vegan. Lorene was a vegan. I think for spiritual as well as health reasons. I think I love this picture because this is the design sense that really it infuses all of Apple. Simplicity, no extra frills.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you were saying, Andy, about the sort of legacy of inside that company, because I think where you see a lot of companies fail is when they manage by covering their ass, basically. They say, I want to make sure that I've got specs that look good and I won't get fired. Or I've got to make sure that, you know, this product looks the way my bosses expect and I won't get fired. And Andy, what you were describing was a company where they're like, that's not what we're after. What we're after is passion and a defense of the user, of the person who's going to end up with this. So to me, it seems like the test of his legacy is if that can persist in Apple, and the test of whether it can persist is there's got to be one guy at the end of the day that makes that call. That had always been Steve Jobs up to now.
I just got a message from my son Jake, who said that he remembered going through my closet in my office in the mid-'90s and finding an old black PowerBook, one of the ones that was done without Jobs. And I said how angry I was and how Apple sucked at the time. And would we think that now we'd be so religious typing about on these machines? And again, it goes to Steve Jobs. You know, the Pepsi Man was the worst thing that happened to the company. When he came back, you know, it's not just that he built the company. The fact that he then rebuilt it for $1 a year, the fact that he had that determination, you know, it's... as we said earlier on, it's hard to outdo the hyperbole on him.
You know, Jeff, it's funny. I have almost the opposite memory. My dad loved Apple. I always associated Apple with the computers that you had in school. But nobody had Apples at home. We all had IBMs or whatever. And so I didn't really want anything to do with it. And there was a certain point where he would say, you know, these things are really amazing. They're so much better than that junk that you like. You really got to try it out. No. Even, you know, in the Tech TV days, I never had a Mac.
Really?
I never had an Apple computer. No, I was completely Windows. And, you know, I wish I would have listened to him.
That's what he was talking about.
Yeah.
Your dad was a better dad than I am.
When did you switch?
2005.
Wow.
I switched back and forth more times than I can count.
When I switched from Apple to Macintosh, my boss, Steve Newhouse, said it was the equivalent of me converting to Judaism because he was both a Jew and a Windows guy. And he was very happy about it. But then I came back.
I thought that was Linux. Weren't they in Umberto Eco's famous column? Aren't they the Kabbalists?
Let me play a short. There are quite a few tributes already on YouTube going up. Let me play a short video. Can you pick up my computer still? Okay. I'm not sure what this is, but it looks pretty moving. Let's close that out.
Here, have this one. It's live.
It's interesting. People are rushing to their Macs and iMovie and using his technology to make a tribute to Steve. And how quickly and easily they could do it thanks to Steve Jobs.
It was within seconds you saw the Mac logo, little Mac man with this sad face.
You know, until my recent excommunication, I loved nothing more than to go see Steve do a keynote presentation. It was so exciting to go into that room and hear the Beatles or Bob Dylan or classic rock and roll playing, Rolling Stones often, and know that you are going to see Steve come out on the stage and show something that will blow your mind. And of course, as a member of the press, I always was very cautious to control my demeanor and not to applaud and just sit stone-faced. But inside, I have to say, I admired his ability to demonstrate this stuff so much. And it was often in these presentations very difficult, I'm sure you agree, Andy, not to just gasp, there are times when you just go, oh. And one of those I remember, of course, was the iPhone announcement, in which Steve talked about the failings of every smartphone to date and how much we hated them. And inside I'm going, yeah, you're right, I hate them, I hate them. And he said, what was it, Andy? Do you remember? He had 4 things on the keynote slide that he wanted to put together in one device.
Oh, he said it's a phone, it's an internet device. It's a phone, it's an internet device, and it's a GPS device.
And it's a music player.
Excuse me, it's a music player. It was 3, I believe.
Yeah.
3 or 4. Well, that's incidental. But yeah, I mean, the thing that it's no wonder why so many when they had these keynotes that were open to the public back then at Macworld Expo. It was like I was the one person that everybody knew who knew somebody who worked for the record company that produced the Beatles, and had heard that maybe they're going to be doing a secret gig someplace, and could I possibly get them in someplace? Because we've all been to so many of these keynotes, especially in the post-Jobs era, when they became they set the template for how you introduce a new product or service. But only Steve really gave you the sense that he was just delighted, because he's been holding on to this secret for a couple of years now, and he just could not wait to tell anybody this incredible thing.
That's true.
Just like when I had the iPad, I could not wait. Like the second that I could tell people about like using the iPad, I wanted to call everybody and tell them about it. And I felt a little bit like Steve at that point. But I mean, from the other side of that, I'm sure that if we took a poll of people watching and listening, most people can remember every single detail of where they were the first time that they first got really, really influenced and really impressed by an Apple device. I mean, I can absolutely tell you every single detail of the computer store in Dedham, Massachusetts, where I first used a Macintosh. Even after having read about it for 3 or 4 months, I could tell you that it was 2 stores down from the Showcase Cinema. It was 1 block down from the AAA Police Supply Store. I could tell you that the room was incredibly over air conditioned. I could tell you about how I noticed for the first time since using computers since I was like 9 or 10, that for the first time I saw a screen with square dots, not just like blobs of light, but square dots.
There it is, by the way. It's an iPod. It's a phone. Could you turn up the audio on this? It's an internet device. This is where he revealed it.
An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone.
I'll never forget this.
Are you getting it?
We were so excited. Scott Bourne was sitting next to me.
These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device.
We knew it was an iPhone, but...
And we are calling it iPhone.
That was it.
Today...
Little did we know. I mean, they really did reinvent the phone.
Yeah, I mean, it's not bragging if it turns out to be true.
Yeah.
They would not... Steve never introduced a printer.
He also a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
Actually, here it is, but we're going to leave it there.
This was the first time we saw it. He's got it in his pocket. Also a master of the reveal. I can't remember how many times he had an iPod, an iPhone, a Nano in his pocket and pulled it out. There it is. He has it.
Oh, I had it the whole time.
I had it the whole time.
I think that's part of the reason people are having such a hard time realizing that he's gone, because we all knew that he was ill for a long time. He was a very sick man. He went on leave multiple times, but he was very much larger than life.
Yeah. And he always came back.
And he always came back. And it wasn't just his stage persona, which everybody loved, but it was the fact that he seemed like he was not going to go down.
Yeah. You're right. That's really true. I never, I remember, Andy, when you and I and Alex were sitting here and he had announced his retirement, it was such a shock to hear that. And it felt so grim. And we were almost eulogizing him, but
we were trying not to, because he only resigned at that point.
But I think you hit the nail on the head, Sarah. We didn't believe he could die. He was so full of life. It just didn't seem possible.
And I think what I keep seeing over and over with the flood of internet comments is people saying, "I can't believe I am so emotional about somebody I never met."
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what,
Yeah.
Leo, the fact that, it's a wonderful tribute to you, too, that you bring people together. Compare this, and I don't mean to denigrate them, but CNN, highly packaged and quote, 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 quote. And what we have here, between not just this, but also the chat room and also people gathering around Twitter, is people who greatly admired this man, and we come together for a good Irish wake to someone we all admire.
That's kind of
and in our ways love.
I'm glad you said that because that's what I wanted this to be.
We could use more Irish in the wake, but
We
yeah.
can get some Irish. I'll get some Irish right now.
No, I mean, there is still to this moment there is still a pan of my grandmother's chicken on the counter. There is one of those microwave in the bag things of rice still in the microwave, because that's when I got text message by about 5 different people with the news, and one of them was from the Sun Times. Make sure that, hey, we were holding a spot for you if you can get a memorial ready in the next hour. And so, meanwhile, I have to tell people. Some friends were asking about. Can't talk now. I'm writing about Steve, and at least 2 of them were like, "Geez, I mean, you've known this for a while. Why didn't you write this obituary beforehand?" And how could I explain to them that he wasn't? I wouldn't know how I would feel about his death until he had died.
Sure.
I couldn't. It felt gauche, and it felt wrong, and it also felt like, to forgive what might be a tasteless phrase, whistling through the graveyard, to write a eulogy for a person that we all knew was going to be gone soon.
Sadly, it is what we do, isn't it, Andy, in our business?
Yeah, but I'm with Andy. I couldn't have written that.
No, I agree.
I couldn't have sat down and written that.
Well, as somebody who has prepared those obit files before, you can't write the actual obit. You can write a biography. You can write what they did, but you can't really write what their life meant.
Markov's was up like that, which, the Times has them do that, and they have them do it for a reason, and I guess we would also criticize them if they came up and didn't have anything of note. But yes, you're right. It feels, some have commented online, it feels so canned, it doesn't have the emotion. Compare that with, let's say, Ohm, who is very much of the moment in his post, and he talks about how he's lost his Elvis. And it's a kind of a thought that only Ohm could come up with. At the moment, he was watching a baseball game, he saw the news, it took his breath away, and this was what he lived by acknowledging what this happened. And you don't do that in a canned obit. You're absolutely right.
Walt Mossberg wrote a very beautiful tribute to Steve. Walt knew Steve very well, spent a lot of time with him, and that's appearing now in All Things D, and obviously was written not ahead of time, but written as soon as he learned about it. He ends it with a little story about Steve after his liver transplant. He says, while he was recuperating at home in Palo Alto, Steve invited me over to catch up on industry events that had transpired during his illness. It turned into a 3-hour visit punctuated by a walk to a nearby park that he insisted we take, despite my nervousness about his frail condition. He explained that he walked each day and that each day he set a farther goal for himself, and that today the neighborhood park was his goal. As we were walking and talking, he suddenly stopped, not looking well. I begged him to return to the house, noting that I didn't know CPR and could visualize the headline, "Helpless reporter lets Steve Jobs die on the sidewalk." But he laughed and refused, and after a pause kept heading for the park. We sat on a bench there talking about life, our families, and our respective illnesses. I had had a heart attack some years earlier. He lectured me about staying healthy, and then we walked back. Steve Jobs didn't die that day, to my everlasting relief, but now he is really gone, much too young, and it is the world's loss. That's Walt Mossberg writing in All Things D.
Ryan Katsanis has a picture of him in that park.
Yeah, that is, it's interesting that Steve was taking those walks, and for whatever reason, we didn't see pictures of it. I think people were very reluctant to invade his privacy.
Yeah.
TMZ published a terrible, is that on, where is that?
500px.com.
Okay, 875-827, I'll pull it up. The TMZ had a really ridiculously
it was doctored.
edited video photo of him.
875-827.
But
do we still know whether it was him?
Photo/875-827.
I don't think it was very accurate if it was. But
photo,
yeah. Let me put this in. I want to show you this picture because this is kind of poignant. This is apparently, there's no question this is a real picture. It's Steve Jobs alone in a public garden near Jobs' house. Probably that park, resting. And this was taken June 15th. So before he, in fact, resigned from Apple.
A friend of mine happens to be Jobs' doctor. And, you know, he obviously couldn't talk about the condition as it went on, but he told me that one day he went over to see Steve, and they just spent 3 hours on the bed watching movies on his iPad. And it's kind of a lovely image.
You know, I only have one anecdote about Steve Jobs, and I've told it many times before, but I'll tell it one more time. Will Hurst invited my family to spend time with Steve's family, a few other people from the tech industry up at Wintoon, which is the Hearst's corporate retreat up by Mount Shasta. It's a beautiful place. It was built by William Randolph Hearst I, and painted and decorated to look like a Bavarian village out of Snow White. And it's bucolic. It's on the raging McCloud River. Each of us had our own, I want to say cabin, but really it was a mansion. Each of us had our own house decorated by William Randolph Hearst. And we would meet each night in the dining room and have dinner. One evening we joined Steve and his wife Lorene and his two kids. At the time I think they only had two, at their house, which was overlooking the river, for caviar. And we played volleyball one day with Steve, who ripped off his shirt and ripped into the game, and then ripped into me for not playing hard enough as we started to lose to Will Hurst's team. I also remember a long conversation that I was more a spectator to than a participant in. It's interesting. I spent time with Steve's kids. I read them books and stuff. But because I was a journalist, Steve, I don't know if he naturally avoided me. He was working at Pixar and Next at the time, not at Apple. He hadn't gone back. This was around 94 or 95. I think 94, because my daughter was around 2, and my son wasn't born yet. He had a long conversation with another technology leader, a guy who worked at MIPS, about Apple itself. He was clearly very interested still in Apple. I'm sure John had asked him a question that got him started, but he went on for quite some time about where Apple had gone wrong. He said, with the Macintosh, we had a 10-year lead on Microsoft, but they threw me out, and they made no more advances, and Microsoft caught up. And by then, Windows 3.1 had come out. He said, by the time Windows 3.0, he said, came out, we had lost our lead. He was railing, really, about the way Apple was run. He didn't like the clones. He obviously didn't like anything going on about Apple. He wasn't talking about Next or Pixar, which he could, at that time, have justifiably held up as successes. He's had all eyes on Apple. I don't think he ever let go of Apple. I think he wanted to go right back there, and I think he was very glad. I'm sure he lobbied very hard when Apple decided it needed a next-generation operating system. Remember, they were working with IBM to create something called Pink that was a horrible failure, something to succeed System 7 and later System 9. Then they went to Jean-Louis Gasset, former Apple vice president, and looked at his BOS to see if that was the next Apple operating system. And it was a very, very good operating system at the time, but still not good enough. Finally, they looked at Next, and not only did they buy Next Step, actually it was called OpenStep at the time, and they got great engineers like Avi Tevanian, but thrown into the mix, they happened to get this guy named Steve Jobs back. It wasn't very long before they fired Gil Amelio, who was trying to run the company at that time, and reinstated Steve Jobs. Steve immediately reversed all of the mistakes that Scully, Spindler, and Amelio had made in his absence and recreated Apple. I remember very well, we were at Tech TV. In 1998, we just launched when Apple launched its first iMac in Bondi Blue. And it was a revolution already. No floppy disk, USB only. A computer that didn't look like a computer. It looked like something you'd want in your living room.
Well, it had colors. It wasn't a beige box.
Yeah, and we don't like to create the impression that Steve was a snake oil salesman. But don't you remember that it was almost an entire day before anybody seemed to notice? Oh, that's right. It doesn't have a floppy drive.
No floppy.
Why did we not notice this until today?
But you know what? He was right. Yep. He was right. Is there a floppy in a computer today anymore? No.
Yep.
No.
I was looking at the ad for the brochure for the next cube, and I think that it was printed in 1988, I think, because it took a couple of years for them to actually get their first next cubes out the door. And of course, there's that. It's a very much a Steve Jobs sort of brochure. It's exactly the shape and size of a next cube, and the front of it looks like a next cube. And the joke was that if you'd pre-ordered, you could actually put this on your desk and pretend that they'd actually made their ship date for your next cube. But that's neither here nor there. There was a page that had just the dry specs and just the dry features of it. And this is in 1988, and you see things like, it has Ethernet built in. It uses a display postscript. It's all based on object-oriented programming. It includes open source elements. It uses optical storage. It has instead of fixed hard drive. It has the idea that the computer is not the repository of your data. It's merely an expression of your data, because in a sense you would basically pop out this optical cartridge that would contain your entire world. So you could basically put this into any computer, and that computer would become your computer, on and on and on and on. 68030 processor, on and on and on and on. And then, the next cube failed, but good heavens, 1995, 1996, every single computer had exactly that same feature set. And the rare times where I get into discussions about people who thought that Steve Jobs wasn't all he was cracked up to be, I would have to make the point that, look, he didn't do the Macintosh just once. I mean, he has almost an unblemished track record of backing horses that were going to pay off 4 or 5 years in the future. But he was the person who's, when the idea was presented to him, said, "Yep, exactly. I saw the future once, and it looked exactly like this thing you're showing me right now. Go to it and make a success out of it."
Malik writes a really moving tribute on GigaOM today. And one of the things he says I think is really brilliant. He says, Steve was my secret muse, and he is the secret muse to many of us in the Valley. Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Dave Morin, Jack Dorsey. We are all part of the tribe called Jobs. There is a whole generation of entrepreneurs who ask themselves this one question: what will Steve do? What would Steve have done? And I think that that's absolutely true. If you were to try to make the best move in any given situation, you couldn't do much better than saying, what would Steve do?
Leo, I just note that Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, coming out November 21st, is tonight number 93 on Amazon.
Yeah, not a surprise.
Same picture on Apple.com is on the cover of that book.
Here's a piper playing in Cupertino, California.
Oh.
I was actually asked tonight, I talked to a couple of different radio stations before joining you guys, and one of the questions that I was asked that I didn't really know how to answer was, do you think that there's going to be a surge in sales of Apple products tomorrow? And I said that no, I don't think so, because the focus was always on Apple, the company, and the products. I don't think people had that kind of attachment to Steve. But the fact that you could even think that this would be like a Kurt Cobain dying, like a John Lennon dying, that you want to renew that connection to this person that you love so much, even if at a distance, that you want to own something connected to them somehow.
Don't you want to go to a store and just be with other fanboys and girls?
I was actually thinking that tomorrow, I'm donating platelets tomorrow, and it's near an Apple store, and it's going to be very hard to talk myself out of just afterwards stopping by and just seeing what the mood is there.
This video is from the One Infinite Loop, the Apple campus in Cupertino, and I think it's moving that a guy decided, I'm going to bring my bagpipes down and play a sad song, a dirge, a tribute to Steve. I would like to be there right now, to be honest. I imagine there's quite a few people on the Cupertino campus with candles.
As Scoble said, they're moved out to the street.
Yeah, you can see already the camera crews looking, to find somebody to interview. And
but you can bet there's going to be tributes and flowers and old Macs and old Newtons and God knows what all.
Pippins.
Don't put a Newton there. He had nothing to do with it. I'm sure he'd be the first to tell you.
He killed the Newton, he killed the Pippin, he killed the clones. Those are the first things he did when he came back.
Do not put a Newton on the steps of Apple's Cupertino campus. You will not be welcome. You will be haunted by the ghost of Steve Jobs. We've got Leander Kahaney on the line right now of the Cult of Mac. Of course, Leander's been covering Macintosh for quite some time. Leander Kahaney, thank you for joining us this evening.
Sure, no problem, Leo.
Very sad evening. What are your thoughts?
It's a horrible shock, even though it was clear that it was going to happen any time.
Cult of Mac, of course, the book and the webpage kind of says it all. Celebrates the cult of being a Macintosh fanatic. I think everybody tonight is saddened whether they were Macintosh fanatics or not. What are your thoughts right now, Leander?
Yeah, he had a huge impact. I get a lot of email from people, just saying how much of an influence he had on their lives. A lot of people who are designers or artists, got into it because they were so inspired by Apple and the products they love. It's had a huge impact. I mean, look at the iPhone 4S yesterday. This is a massive event, not just for the tech industry, but for the entire culture. I mean, the entire world tunes into this. It's like it's as big as, remember in the 60s when the Beatles came out with an album, and there was all that anticipation. Well,
it's like that, isn't it? It really is like 1967 when Sgt. Pepper came out. You waited at the record store to get it. I wonder how many people will go to Apple stores tomorrow and maybe just buy a little something.
Yeah, I don't know how to feel about that, to be honest. There's a lot of stuff on Twitter tonight about people going into the Apple stores, and I don't know, something about going to a store.
Well, I think for a lot of people, it's just the gathering place. It may not be about shopping so much as it is about being near to his legacy.
Right, it's to be around other Mac fans, I think. That's why people were lining up when those stores opened. It wasn't to be first inside the store, it was to hang out with other Mac people.
To be with the sort of people who would be at the store at that time of day.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bill Gross posting on Google Plus at 5 p.m., which is right about, it was about half an hour after we learned about this. Steve Jobs was in 17% of every tweet on Twitter. It was only shortly after that that Twitter went down entirely.
Crashed Twitter?
Crashed Twitter.
I'm reading this story that Brian Lamb posted about the whole Gizmodo iPhone prototype.
Gizmodo not beloved by Apple.
No, but used to be. He and Steve had quite a friendly relationship, and he actually has, for better for worse, printed out a lot of the back and forth between the two of them via email. But at the time where Apple realized that they were in possession of the phone and wanted to get it back, and he's Steve saying, there are a couple ways we can do this. Where do I send somebody?
Isn't it
Gizmodo
interesting
says, I don't have it.
That Steve himself handled this?
Oh, yeah. And then, towards the end, when they're trying to figure out how this is going to go down, Brian says, I told him I had to talk to my dudes. We'll figure something out. Before he hung up, he asked me, what do you think of it? And I said, it's beautiful.
That's Steve right there. I want it back. I'm going to kill you. What do you think?
You like it?
You like it? Leander, are you going to write a tribute to Steve Jobs? This must be very difficult. We were talking earlier with Andy about how none of us wanted to write an obituary.
I know, yeah. I started to write one. I've been, working on writing one for weeks, and tonight I'm just, the phone's ringing off the hook, so I don't have a chance to get into it. But I have very mixed feelings about Steve. On the one hand, he's someone to be really admired, and has had the profoundest influence. But I think he has a mixed legacy. As someone I look up to, like my big hero was Joe Strummer, from The Clash.
Yeah.
Who was a working class hero, and I had a working class upbringing. I'm a bit of a sort of, a working class guy, and I always had bad feelings about mega rich businessmen, which Steve Jobs does. And I was looking back at some of the stuff that was written about Pixar, the history of Pixar before Pixar, when Toy Story was a hit, and how he handled the whole IPO and all the share issues of Pixar. And there was a lot of disgruntled people, a lot of people very unhappy with how much money he made off of that, off of their labor. And the same is true at Apple, in the early days. I mean, a lot of people were upset with the way that he handled the money there. And then look at China, I'm very uncomfortable with what's going on in China. And his philanthropy, his lack of philanthropy. I mean, he has no public record. I don't know whether he's been donating money, and he kind of should have been because of his image, that what he stood for, his values, his countercultural liberal values that I think a lot of people felt he had, and yet in his real life, there was no evidence that he actually lived up to those. So I don't know how I feel. I was trying to write all this down, and it came out a mess. Because on the other hand, I love Apple's products, and I've been in love with them forever. I don't give a shit about cars, planes, anything else. Music and Apple products really are really what I've been into these years.
I think you summarized it very well. It is a conflicting bunch of stuff, isn't it? But in some ways, I think that's what makes a person great. Is you can't pigeonhole them. He was, he apologized to no one. He did what he did. He didn't look back. He said, maybe I've made some mistakes, but he went full speed ahead, and it was that kind of determination that made him what he was. And ultimately, Leander, I don't think he was there to make money or to steal from people or to take the fruit of people's labor. I really do believe he was there to change the world. Do you not agree?
I don't know. I don't know. It's hard. It's really hard. It's difficult to reconcile. I don't know. I don't know what to say because, he was in charge of. You hear a lot of people who work at Apple say it's not a happy place to work.
Oh, that's for sure true. You work 60, 70 hours a week. Right. You fail and you hear it. You get kicked in the butt.
You have your own company, Leo. I have my own company now. I'm trying to. I do it because. I figured out what I like about it, which is I like to give people jobs. I want to give people work.
Yeah, I wouldn't run this company that way, and I'm sure you wouldn't run your company.
No,
that
way. Look at. I mean, they did some most amazing things. He's had the most astonishing impact on our society. For 30 years, all of our technological products were either conceived or perfected by Jobs, and. They're as big as the television or the car or the telephone. It's stuff that we use all day, every day, not just for work, not just for play, but for creativity, for communication. It's an astonishing legacy. It's like a giant. But
Leander, this is Jeff Jarvis here. Is part of the problem too that there's a different culture of the obit where you're from and here, where in the UK when I read obits in the Guardian and the Telegraph. They try harder to take a full measure of a life, right. Whereas here our tradition is more to be awake and a tribute, and so I'm hearing you trying to struggle with which way to go there.
Yeah, as a tribute, I think it's very clear that he has a very strong legacy, stronger than anybody, probably on the consumer side of the technology industry anyway. And as a businessman, I mean, amazing. But you're right, Jeff. I mean, I'm definitely trying to do a British kind of, obituary. But I was sort of thinking about my dad, as well, and what a lot of people say he's a father figure. He's a father figure for a lot of people. And I was thinking about my dad and my heroes and the people I emulate, and the people I like, and you go, well, I don't know if I really do want to be like Steve Jobs in all aspects of his life.
It's a good point.
He would, and also, I mean, it does a disservice to somebody to make him into something that he's not. I think there is a point to be made that there's a difference between a full obituary and a memorial. The thing that I wrote for the Sun-Times tonight is memorial, not really an obituary. But don't you, when you try to sand down all the rough edges of a personality, you're left with something that's smooth and boring, as not something that resembles what it originally was. I'm perfectly content to acknowledge all the stuff about Steve that kind of embarrasses people who were very fond of the work that he did and what he represented. But I think the next few days there should be an awareness that there is a full measure of a man, and that sometimes just saying the positive stuff just doesn't do the job.
I've asked, there's a very famous story about the early days of Woz and Jobs. Steve Wozniak was the programmer, Jobs was the business guy. Atari came to Jobs and said, we want you to write Breakout. We will pay you, I can't remember the amount, I think it was $5,000. Jobs went to Wozniak, said, I want you to write Breakout, I'll pay you $500. Woz wrote it. Jobs collected the money, never told Woz how much money he got, and took the lion's share of it. Woz found out about that not so long ago, maybe 5 years ago. And I remember several times in comfortable surroundings on a cruise ship, relaxed, asking Woz about it, and he refused ever to say anything bad about Steve. Even though that must have been a hell of a blow to think that this guy, and this is early in their careers, this is before Apple, really screwed Woz. I think there was more to that story. I think that but that's the gist of it. So yeah, you're right, Andy. We got to tell the story in its fullness, and he was a piece of work, unlike any human I've ever met or known. And I wouldn't want to work for him, but I could tell you some of the best in the business, knowing how horrible it might be to work for him, did anyway, because he brought them to great heights, didn't he?
Yeah, and at the same time, you want to wait for a couple shovels full of dirt to hit the coffin before you start complaining about how the guy died owing you $500.
Yeah,
sure.
Not Steve. I don't think.
Right. You know, it's funny. I've been approaching.
Before we do that, let me let Leander go, because I know that he has many things to do, including finishing that obituary, which I look forward to reading. Leander Connie on the Cult of Mac.
So I'm back.
Back to work, Leander.
I got a call from the BBC. Do you want me to hang up?
Yeah, well, take care.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. The BBC talking to him now. You know, it's interesting watching mainstream media scramble to find people to talk about this.
Well, it's pervasive. I mean, I went up and when you were on CNN earlier, I went and grabbed our dog from the place where he stays during the day, and I walked in and I was like, "Hey, sorry, I'm running late. I don't know if you heard Steve Jobs." Oh yeah, we heard about it. You know, it's huge everywhere.
It's huge.
Everyone in all walks of life is covering it and hearing about it, and it's unusual. You know, when he was talking about how to cover the death, I have been approaching it up to this point the same way I approached Steve Jobs when he was alive, which is I'm covering technology. And so I'm going to cover his role as a person who created technology. I don't know the guy. I'm not going to comment on his personality or what he was like in his outside life. But, you know, I think that is fair to say, you know, from all reports, he may not have been the most pleasant person to be around. He obviously didn't like the way he played volleyball. And it's one of those things which it always brings me back to what I call the Sinatra principle, which is, you know, do you hate the guy because of what you know, what you've heard about his private life, or do you love his work and what he produced?
We certainly have to honor his work. You know, the thing that this reminds me a little of is Michael Jackson's death. Also unexpected, also very young, also a complicated story to tell. But you know, we ended up celebrating his art as much as his, you know, anything, without forgetting his personal life. And so I think that there's, you know, it's always complex. Every human. I like what you said, Andy. Every human is complex. There are rough edges on everybody, and we should certainly remember the man for who he was, not merely write his hagiography.
There's
we'll
another
have time
area
to read that in a month when the Isaacson book comes out.
Yeah. There's another thing we haven't even talked about with him is him and showbiz. Pixar.
Yep.
You know, he changed how movies are made, and he had a huge impact on Disney as well.
He changed how music is sold. He completely tore the record industry down and rebuilt it in his image. Jason Snell, is that who we have on the line right now? Jason Snell, editor-in-chief of Macworld magazine. Jason, how much time have you been able to spend, or were you able to spend with Steve Jobs? You know, towards the end of his life, he did not want to talk to the press at all.
Yeah, you know, I didn't ever, you know, I didn't do like Walt Mossberg and go over to his house or anything like that.
No, I mean, that's pretty amazing, yeah.
That is a crazy story, and it's a beautiful piece of writing by Walt. You know, I came to Macworld about the same time that Steve came back to Apple, and you know, I had some interactions. I interviewed him for the 20th anniversary of the Mac, which was fascinating because, you know, he's famously not been focused on the past, right? He's always, there's that famous story about how he found all this old Mac memorabilia when he moved back to Apple, and somebody said, hey, what do you want to do? And he's like, get it away, right? So I had to talk to him about the future, and, you know, he was gracious, but he also, you know, gave the clear sense that he would have rather had teeth pulled than do an interview. And you know, I will admit that I have had many nightmares the night before an Apple event about having an interaction with Steve Jobs. Half of them are he's mean to me, and the other half he's actually very nice to me and says, I don't know why I have this reputation. But you know, the presentations, I was there at the first iPod launch and all those presentations, and I mean, just covering those products and seeing how that company turned around with him in charge of it. I mean, it is, I'm sure you've been saying this all along, it's sort of this perfect combination of things. He had all of these things, these traits that we're never going to see in our lifetimes, I think, in one person again, because it's such a remarkable, he's a great showman, but also had great product taste, plus also understood the technology. I mean, it's just a crazy combination of skills.
Here's something that's going around on Facebook right now. Mike Mattis worked at Apple and worked on Photo Booth when it was released in 2005, and decided this would be an opportune moment to post these images that Steve took when he was the first person to use Photo Booth outside the Photo Booth team. Pictures we've all taken since then, exactly the same.
Sure have.
But it just shows you.
Now we use apps that do them even better.
Yeah, it just shows you the spirit of this guy.
When else are you going to see a picture of Steve Jobs looking surprised at anything? They're in the lower left.
I love that picture. I'm so glad Mike shared these with everybody, because that's a side of Steve Jobs I don't think many of us saw. And you can imagine what a painful moment this was for Mike, showing Steve Jobs for the first time his photo booth filters. So, Jason, have you written the obituary yet? Have you? What is Macworld doing for this?
You know, we posted something. We actually started working on something earlier this year, thinking, well, at least we should do some research. Yeah. And then when the resignation happened, we put something much longer together, and some of that went in the magazine. And we didn't post it online. By the time it was ready, it sort of seemed like the moment had passed. And I said, you know what, let's hold it, because, you know, who knows what might happen. And in case the worst thing happens, we can take it and quickly get it together. And it's, you know, it's more an appreciation of what he did at Apple in his 2 stints there and the kind of amazing run he had there. But I'm like the rest of us, and like Andy, who wrote a couple really nice pieces on his site and on the Chicago Sun-Times. I'm racking my brain for sort of my personal feelings about it, and hope to write something about that. But it's funny, you see these 2 lines of thought about this. There's the one line, which is titan of industry, legendary figure, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford kind of person. And then there's the other one, which is how the products have kind of touched our lives. And it's fascinating to see both of those kinds of stories going on right now.
Jason, we'll let you go. We're going to wrap up our coverage here because, well, we could just go on crying all night, but life goes on. Thank you. Any final thoughts, Jason?
No, I mean, I think you've got it. I think you've got it covered. It's you know, I feel fortunate to watch this guy do his thing at the top of his game, because I don't think we're going to see his like again. And he can be controversial, and there were definitely rough edges. But I mean, you would, if you try to make a movie of his life, nobody would believe it.
Nobody would believe it. You got it. Thank you, Jason Snell, Macworld Magazine editor-in-chief. We appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Leo.
We're going to get Chris Breen on just for his final thoughts, but maybe I can go around the horn here and just say some final words from Andy Ihnatko. And yes, do read Andy's tribute in the Chicago Sun-Times. It's very moving.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, in that tribute, I said that the way I wound it up by saying that yesterday I lived in a world that had Steve Jobs in it, and now I'm very aware that I'm living in a world that without Steve Jobs in it. And I, like Jason, I don't have a story about walking through the park with Steve and resting on a bench and talking about life with him, but it's sort of like that first time when, remember when they redesigned all the money, the first time you touched a $20 bill that was not exactly like every $20 bill you had ever touched in your entire life. Steve Jobs has been a peripheral character in my life and so many other lives since we've had memory. And so now that we live in a world in which there will never be any news about Steve Jobs, there will never be a company that he had a hand in on an ongoing basis anymore. It's going to be, it's a minor adjustment to be sure. Let's not overblow things, but he leaves behind a hole.
I'd sure like to go to one more Steve Jobs keynote, I got to say.
Yeah.
Tom Merritt, some final thoughts from you?
You know, when Leander was talking about people working at Apple and how they feel, I've known a few people who've worked at Apple, and the one that sticks out in my mind is a designer that I used to live next to who had to take a job at Apple, even though he lived in Oakland, which meant a horrible commute, hour and a half each way. But he was so excited to get there. And every time I talked to him, I'm like, "Do you like?" You know, he was complaining about how hard the commute is and how hard his work was and his long hours. I'm like, "Do you?" He's like, "I love it there." And I think, you know, Steve Jobs certainly could be seen as very arrogant. He could be seen as maybe even disingenuous from time to time. But he created a place that people were incredibly passionate about one way or another. People wanted to work there, and he created products that, you know, you could look at them and say, well, that's stupid. Why would anyone want a phone that does that? Why would anyone want a tablet? Why would you call it the iPad? And he ends up being right 9 times out of 10. Yeah, there's a cube every once in a while, but it's an incredible legacy to look back on.
Yeah, I liken it to playing chess. I can see 1 or 2 moves ahead, but anytime you try to play with Steve Jobs, you know he's seeing 20 moves ahead. He knows more about what's going on the board than anybody. This guy was masterful, and I can't tell you the number of times I've said Apple's making a wrong turn opening its own retail stores. Apple's making a wrong turn going to Intel, and been wrong every single time. Let's get Chris Breen on the line. He's the Mac Daddy, editor of the Mac 911 column on Macworld.com, and of course a longtime friend. And I'm sure you're pretty sad tonight, Chris.
I am. I think we all saw this coming, but it's unfortunate that it happened as soon as it did. I'd hoped that Steve would go on for several more years, and it was kind of a sudden announcement, and too bad.
I'm kind of sad that we never got that one interview with Steve. The one, like, okay, I'm retired now. I can tell it as it was. Maybe a relaxed Steve. But I don't know if we'd ever have seen a relaxed Steve with his hair down. I think he was.
Well, I know his book is coming out shortly.
I hope it's good. I hope it's honest.
I do too, you know, and I have to think that he knew this was coming, and I think he took the time to get it done properly. I hope, because I think that he was fairly secure in his legacy. So I do hope that he took the time to really talk about the things he did and his philosophy. I think if you go back to the Stanford address he gave several years ago, I think you saw an honest Steve Jobs there, somebody who had looked at a shortened life and really was taking the experience that he gained over years and said, you know, when you're looking at the end, you need to do what's important to you and follow your heart. And I think that's exactly what he ended up doing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate your joining us at this late hour, and thank you for being. I think really this is a moment where we all want to be together a little bit with each other, and appreciate him, and I know we're all going to miss him.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay. Thanks.
Sarah Lane, your final thoughts.
Well, I knew you'd come to me eventually. I'm just trying to not cry.
I know, me too. You know what? Me too.
Same here.
Me too.
You know, I mean,
it's not easy.
And I'm not sure I'll make it, but I guess I'm just really glad that Steve Jobs and Apple has given me a reason to really enjoy my livelihood.
No kidding. No kidding. It's going to be a very boring world without him. Jeff Jarvis?
I'm having the same problem Sarah's having. One thought, just that I'm eternally grateful.
Yeah.
He enabled me to do a lot. He enabled everyone to do a lot. And thank you, Steve.
We're going to wrap this up. We thank you for joining us this evening, and I think it's great when we can all be together at a time like this. Eric is going to do, is he here? So does he want to start going live right now? Okay, so I'm really glad that Eric's here. Eric Lanigan is here to do his Tech Talk back. What does he call it now? Late Night with Eric? Late Night Tech. And as you know, that's a call-in show, and I think that's a really good way to spend the rest of the evening is calling in and sharing your feelings. We've all had a chance to talk. It's going to be your chance to talk. Let me play this video to end. Thanks to Gizmodo. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll just continue on covering this world of tech that we find so exciting. Eric Lanigan's coming up next on TWiT. Have a good night, everybody.
Sorry about that.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.